So it's a great honor for me to chair the first panel of this colloquium, a panel entitled Interdisciplinary Perspectives. The premise of this colloquium is that an interdisciplinary perspective crossing law, political science, sociology is needed to fill the conceptual void, vacuum, in which the concept of trust lies. As a philosopher, not also sociology, political science, but philosophy, as a philosopher, I would also have a lot to say on the subject, notably on Hobbes, Locke, of course, but also Spinoza, Rousseau, Antonio Gramsci, among others, and on the concept of trust, confidence, recognition, obedience, legitimacy. So I am only philosopher. This first panel is inspiring and prestigious with Professor Nelly Demireva from the University of Essex, Professor Raquel Baradas de Freitas from Trinity College, Léna Géron from the University of Liège, and Céline Romainville from the University of Louvain, and last but not least, Martin Loughlin of the London School of Economics. I will introduce them in more detail when I give them the floor. Each speaker has just half an hour, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It will be around 11:30. Then I propose that each of the speakers can react, if they wish, to each other's presentation. Then will be a discussion with all of yours until 12:30. And as the organizers of the colloquium are adept to staccanovism, there will be no break before lunchtime. I propose the following running order. First, Professor Loughlin, then Professor Baradas de Freitas, then Professor Demireva, and finally, Professor Romainville and Géron. I think it's more comfortable to speak from the desk, but it's up to you. But I think it's more comfortable, and I think the PowerPoint remote control is on the desk. The first speaker will be Professor Martin Loughlin. He's professor of public law at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and have been professor at Warwick, Harvard, Glasgow, Manchester, and also Berlin, Freiburg, Yale, among others. He's the author of many books and articles on public law, but also on legal theory, legal philosophy, and political philosophy. For many years, Mr. Loughlin, I've been reading your work. You are one of the leaders of the school of thought now as political constitutionalism, which defends constitutionalism and the rule of law, but proposes a substantive, non-formalistic, politically centered conception of constitution. I mentioned some of the Martin Loughlin books: Public Law and Political Theory, The Idea of Public Law, Political Jurisprudence. He's also co-editor of two collective works that have become classics: The Paradox of Constitutionalism and The Twilight of Constitutionalism, with a question mark, very important, I think. And his last two books are Against Constitutionalism in 2022 and The British Constitution, a very short introduction, published last year, but I think it's the second edition of a book published 10 years earlier. Professor Loughlin, the title of your speech is Trust and Political Rule. What is the place of trust in the constitution of the main forms of government identified by the political thinkers? Is representative democracy possible without a minimum of trust on the part of citizens? The floor is yours.
No, I can do it, I hope. Thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction, and thanks also to the organisers for inviting me. It's a subject on which I have to confess I haven't really spent a lot of time systematically thinking about, so I was very grateful for the opportunity to do so. And the more that I read on the subject, the greater the task appeared, because it's a huge topic. I have 25 minutes or so to cover this, so I shall have to be very brief and disciplined. My presentation has 4 main parts. After briefly introducing the concept of trust, and I will only say a few words about it because I thought my other 2 speakers who were going to speak more generally about trust would speak first. I'll then deal with the concept of trust in the classical narratives of the constitution of political order, and then look at the role of trust in the main forms of government, and then finally to say a few words about trust in the most common form of political rule in the contemporary Western world, and that is representative democracy. So let me begin with a few words on the concept of trust. Trust is the glue that holds societies together. Without a minimal level of trust that people place in one another, society would soon disintegrate. But what is trust? How is it generated? How is it sustained? How is it lost? These are all matters of considerable complexity. And all I will say about that is that trust is what is needed to enable people to negotiate their way through the world. Since we can never be sure about what the future will hold, we are obliged to place our trust in certain constants. And these constants are generally generated by habit and experience. Trust functions by converting a multiplicity of possibilities into a range of probabilities. The concept is mainly studied by sociologists and economists. Sociologists treat trust as a type of integrative mechanism, a means by which, in a world of interdependence, a relatively stable set of relationships can be sustained. Economists build on that insight to show that trust is essential to the underpinning of a thriving economy. Trust is that which is needed to generate a stability of expectations that underpins the efficient operation of markets. Now, from that perspective, trust might appear to be a relational quality acquired through the formation of interpersonal ties. But the type of trust that both sociologists and economists are most concerned with is trust that is situated in the formal structures through which society functions. And it's this type of institutionalized trust with which we are most concerned when reflecting on the question of political rule. So let me come to these questions. And with respect to the foundation of political order, I want to start, not surprisingly, with Hobbes, who brings us to the threshold of modern political thinking. Although trust is not commonly thought of as figuring in Hobbes' scheme, this is deceptive. After all, what are we to make of an account of life in a state of nature, an account of a world of perpetual struggle, a war of all against all, in which force and fraud emerge as the cardinal virtues, in which there can be no industry because its fruits are uncertain, no culture, no society, and no technological development? The answer is surely that Hobbes founds his account of the rationality of political rule on the conviction that in a state of nature, in a world without government, social interaction among people is governed by extreme distrust. The only way to break the cycle, Hobbes argues, is by the people entering into a covenant to establish an ordered regime of sovereign and subject. This covenant creates a political relationship, a rudimentary sense of trust. But we might note that it establishes two trust-based relationships. The first is between the people who covenant to establish a sovereign, because a covenant involves a promise, and reliance on a promise is founded on trust. And the second is between the people and the sovereign. It is this second relationship, the ruler-ruled relationship, that is of more interest, not least because Hobbes is clear that the sovereign is the office created by the covenant, but the sovereign is not itself a party to the covenant. Nevertheless, his point is that only within the framework of authoritative and enforceable rules, the sovereign's commands, can a more generalized, institutionalized sense of trust evolve. We might also note that trust is not entirely absent from Hobbes' account of the role of the sovereign. Since that role exists to procure the safety of the people, it is an implicit notion. But it becomes more explicit when Hobbes states that government depends on a mutual relation between protection and obedience. Protego, ergo, obligo. Hobbes' account, I should say finally, does not permit subjects to rebel against the sovereign. But the logic of his argument does suggest that rulers who fail to provide protection break this implicit notion of trust and lose their claim to the subject's obedience. And in this respect, his scheme might actually not be so different from Locke's. Before coming to Locke, however, we should note the radical claims made by the levellers. Hobbes wrote during a period of intense civil strife. His studies of de Cive, 1642, and Leviathan in 1651 effectively bookend the beginning and the end of the English Civil War. And in 1646, right in the middle of this period, a political group that came to be known as the Levellers was established. Although they were a spent force politically within 3 years, their claims had a significant impact on the shaping of modern political order. And what's significant about the Levellers is that the concept of trust is placed right at the center of their arguments. Again, I can't enter into a detailed consideration of their particular arguments here. Suffice it to say that their claims were founded on the conviction that all power derives from the people, that those in authority in Parliament merely held a power of trust. This is their words, power of trust which is ever revocable, because we, the people, are your principals, and you are our agents. And they argue that any exercise of power not derived from that trust is a usurpation. The Levellers at that time were putting forward a revolutionary argument. Political power does not derive from above, from God, but from below, from the people. And since the people are the principals and the government their agents, government must be an office of trust to ensure that representatives act in accordance with that trust, there must be set in place specific methods of authorization, that is, a formal constitution, and to ensure that public officers do not abuse the terms of the trust, methods of accountability and recall must be established. This, of course, is precisely the type of pernicious claim that Hobbes was arguing against. And when we look at the levelers, I think I can be brief on Locke. Once we situate the levelers in the context of those upheavals of 1640s, the argument of John Locke, writing 40 years later, becomes easier to situate. He places the idea of accountable trusteeship at the center of the second treatise of government, argues that political authority is a fiduciary power to act for certain ends. Government is authorized by a delegated power of the people. It's a trust reposed in the government such that there still remains the people as the supreme power to remove the legislature if it acts contrary to the trust reposed in them. Locke's argument can be seen here to be closely following the framing of political authority of the levelers. What he adds is this: when people enter into society and form civil government, they renounce force in favor of laws. And this generates a mode of cooperation that ensures that the people will not engage in revolutionary overthrow upon, in Locke's words, every little mismanagement in public affairs. And as John Donne explains in interpreting Locke, Locke emphasizes that even if illegitimate power might deserve acceptance, it cannot deserve trust. What he's saying is this, that the people might put up with oppressive political regimes because the cost of overthrow is too great. But the fact that they implicitly accept the regime does not mean that that regime rests its claim to power on trust. Now, these contrasting accounts highlight a basic point about the role of trust in political order. Sociological inquiries are primarily concerned with social cooperation between people, a horizontal relationship, whereas political thought is mainly concerned with a vertical relationship, the relationship between the people and their rulers. Hobbes begins by showing that the relationship between people is marked by extreme distrust. And this convinces us to subject ourselves to government by sovereign authority. There may be some bond of trust implicit in that relationship, but it's limited to obedience for protection. The levelers and Locke, by contrast, assume the existence of a people before a formal system of government marked by high levels of social cooperation. And from this assumption, they argue that rulers are bound by the compact to comply with the precise terms of a political trust, which, if abused, is forfeited. Let me come on to regime types. In the world of the levelers and Hobbes and Locke, political obligation was felt to rest on a covenant. In the modern political world, the existence of trust appears to be less a product of a covenant. It is now a matter of policy. It's a strategic response that depends on the design of institutions of rule. And for this purpose, in looking at regime types, we might look briefly at Montesquieu's schematic account of the main forms of government: democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, and despotism. Montesquieu explains their character by distinguishing between the nature and the principle of these forms of government. The nature of a government is determined by identifying who holds power. In democracy, he says it's the people. In aristocracy, it's a section of the people. In monarchy, it's the prince. And in despotic government, it's one alone who rules, and they rule by caprice. What about the principle, the means by which it acts? In a republican democracy, Montesquieu says, the principle of action is virtue, the principle that citizens will be prepared to sacrifice themselves to the public good. A romanticized image of democracy today, certainly. In monarchy, it's not virtue, but honor, and in its corrupt form of despotism, it's fear. And in aristocracy, its driving principle, again, is that of virtue, but virtue that exhibits its working through a principle of moderation. Trust does not directly feature in Montesquieu's scheme, but its significance is brought out by Geoffrey Hawthorne implicitly, who argues that a regime of institutionalized trust can only be created in an aristocracy, a regime that requires conduct to be coded in convention. What Hawthorne's account implicitly reveals is that there is a third set of trust relationships to address with respect to political rule. There's one set of relations between the people who covenant, that horizontal relationship, another concerning relations between rulers and ruled, the vertical relationship, and the third concerns the relations amongst and between the ruling class. Trust is determinative of this type of relationship only in an aristocracy, and this is the type of government that can't be sustained in the modern world. Modern government, founded on a large scale with highly centralized powers, will invariably generate distrust. One celebrated account of this point is Walter Bagehot's classic essay on the English Constitution. Written at the height of Britain's imperial power in 1867, Bagehot showed how the government's effective power was hidden from view by a dignified version of the Constitution, a constitution based on pomp, ceremony, and ritual. It is through this dignified version that government acquires the trust of the people. Britain, Bagehot was arguing, had a monarchical form in its dignified sense, and that is that which excites the reverence of the people. But in reality, it is a disguised aristocratic republic. Now, on that point, he was addressing the relationship between rulers and ruled, so that second type of relationship. But he also showed that Britain's aristocratic republic functioned through certain habits, conventions, and understandings of what he called club government. And here he was giving an account of the third type of relationship, the relations among the governing class. The regime of club government gave rise to a set of entirely informal practices that regulated the relations between Parliament, the government, and the judiciary. This was a regime in which officers could be trusted to understand what appropriate behavior in the conduct of their rule required without those circumstances, those rules of conduct being reduced to formal prescribed rules. And of course, the story of British government ever since is one in which, with the coming of democracy, those trust-based conventions have been systematically eroded and led, well, I'm not going to tell you the story of the history of British government in the 20th century. That's my 20 minutes up. And so I'm not going to tell you the story. But it's about trying to reinforce the system by converting the informal practices to a set of formal rules, largely episodically, as in response to one crisis after another. So I'm coming to my final slide now. Trust in representative democracy. If trust continues to play a role in bolstering political rule, it must now be trust vested in a formal constitutional system with institutional checks and balances. The predominant model, that of representative democracy, is characterized by the existence of a generalized sense of distrust on the part of citizens in those who exercise political power. And this is why emphasis is placed on institutional checks and balances and mechanisms of accountability in the system. A formal constitutional structure is one that is based on the assumption of distrust. The degree of trustworthiness of that system first depends on the degree of shared norms and strong bonds of cooperative action within society. That first set of relations, sometimes called by the economists social capital, the fund of relationships that facilitate civic cooperation. And it's the type of argument that leads to the claim that a strong civil society provides the foundation of a healthy regime of representative democracy. The strength of the second relationship, that between governors and governed, is less concerned with civic engagement and more with the efficacy of the institutional relations of control and accountability. Now, each of those relations offer insight into the current state of representative democracy. But in combination, I'm going to be very synoptic and brief here, in combination, they highlight the significance of a growing lack of trust in representative democracy itself, which is manifest across Europe by the loss of faith in the established political parties that have performed the role of effectively translating whims into policies, and their disintegration is leading to the growing support for a variety of populist movements. Hobbes might say that populism is a symptom of the inability of the sovereign to provide protection and security. If so, it's leading not just to the diminution of trust in a particular type of political rule, but perhaps also to a deeper-seated decline in trust in the ability of the modern state to act as the medium for managing contemporary political risks. On that depressing note, I conclude.